So let's go back to the three mysteries that I introduced earlier. Why do we have no written records? Even though we know that the people within the movement, Jews and Christians, knew how to read and write. Okay, that's the first question. Second question is, why didn't Muhammad name a successor? The third question is, why was the Al-Aqsa Mosque built on top of the Temple Mount? Okay, so this is a paradox because Jews were an extremely important part of that early movement, right? So why would you offend the Jews like this? Right? Okay, to understand what happened, okay, let's go back in time. And we know that in 622, Muhammad goes to Medina, and that's what starts the Islamic movement. But let's just go over to Jerusalem and figure out what's happening there. And once we do that, then we're able to figure out what's going on in that world. It turns out that in 622, there's a major war going on between the two major powers at this time, the Persians and the Byzantines. And it is a deadly war that is engulfing the entire Middle East. Okay? So this is from Wikipedia. All right? Now, guys, never trust Wikipedia as a historical source, but it's useful for us to understand what contemporary historians think. Okay? So this is from Wikipedia. The Jews have aligned themselves with the Persians. Why? Because, first of all, the Romans controlled Jerusalem, and in the year 70, the Romans burned down their temple, and in the year 135, the Romans expelled the Jews from Jerusalem, their holy city. So ever since then, the Jews, obviously they want revenge, but they also want to return to their holy city and rebuild the temple. And with the Persians, they saw this as an opportunity because historically, the Persians and the Jews have gone along very well. Okay? So the Jews helped the Persians take Jerusalem and push out the Byzantines. But when that happens, the Christians in Jerusalem, they revolt and they force out the Jews. And then the Byzantines, under the emperor Heraclius, they return Jerusalem in the First Crusade. Okay, this is the beginning of the idea of crusade. And they retake the city. And then what they do is they expel the Jews from Jerusalem, obviously, but then they start to kill a lot of Jews. Okay? And they force these Jews outside of Jerusalem. So now these Jews have nowhere to go. But there's something called the Constitution of Medina in Arabia, right? There is a prophet, Muhammad, who is promising religious tolerance for all. All can practice their faith in peace, right? So it makes sense for a lot of these Jews, not all of them, but a lot of them, to join this early movement. What's important for us to understand is that at this point, Muslim, is not a distinct religion. Okay? All these people are called believers because Muhammad sees himself as the final messenger of God. Okay? Abraham was the first. Then you had Moses. Then you have Jesus. And now Muhammad is the very last. So all these three different traditions, the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, and the Islam tradition, in the beginning, were all just one religion, one idea, which is to bring God to earth and make everyone understand that God is the true God, okay? To create monotheism on earth. That's the origin of this new religion of Islam. Okay? And this is the Constitution of Medina, which is in the Quran, and which we know to be historically true. Maybe not the wording, okay? But we know that this existed. And these people were called believers. And also, this would also include people who believe in Zoroastrianism, okay? Because Zoroastrianism was also a monotheistic religion. So the Constitution of Medina was an attempt to unite all monotheistic religions into one single tradition that fought for God. Okay? Also, what's really important for us to understand is not only is there all this persecution going on against Jews and against Christians and against Zoroastrians, okay? But also, this is a apocalyptic age where all three traditions believe this was literally the end of the world. If you were Jewish, you believed in a final battle called Armageddon between the Messiah, who would lead you, and against two enemies called Gog and Magog. Okay? Guess what? The Persians and the Romans were fighting each other. So you could easily interpret this to mean the Persians and the Romans were the Gog and Magog enemy. In your tradition, this would be the final battle. This is when Jerusalem is most threatened. Well, the Romans, the Byzantines, just took your city and mastered your people. So in the Jewish tradition, this is the end of days. This is the final battle. And the Messiah would emerge to lead you to final victory. And that person, a lot of Jews could interpret to be Muhammad, okay? So for the Jews, this is the end of days. But for Christians, okay, they also believe this is the end of days because there were final battle between the Antichrist and the Messiah, okay? The Antichrist is obviously Heracles, who is the emperor of the Byzantines, who've been persecuting Christians for a long time. Remember, the official religion of the Byzantines is the Holy Trinity. But most Christians didn't believe in the Holy Trinity, and they were persecuted for the refusal to believe in the Holy Trinity. Okay? So for Christians, this is also the final battle. Zoroastrians believe in a final battle between good and evil. Okay? So this is an apocalyptic age where everyone believes this is it, the final battle. Muhammad is saying to everyone, guys, we're all one people, united by God, and we are here to fight for him. Okay? And this is very appealing for people. So the best evidence for my argument is actually the Quran. Okay? So again, we don't have any written records of Muhammad, but what we do believe is the Quran. It is a collection of many of Muhammad's original sayings that have been redacted over time. Okay? So let's look at some passages from the Quran to better understand how Muhammad was thinking and what he was preaching to the Christians, the Jews, and the Zoroastrians. All right. O people of the book. By this he means both the Christians and the Jews, okay? Why do you argue about Abraham when the Torah and the gospel were not revealed until after him? Will you not reason? Okay, so he's saying, why are we arguing about Scripture? Why are we arguing about belief? When we all acknowledge that Abraham is our forefather. Okay? And Abraham came before the Bible. It came before the Old Testament and the New Testament. So what's the argument? Here you argue about things you know, but why do you argue about things you do not know? Allah knows and you do not know. Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but he was a monotheist, a Muslim. Okay? So this is what Muhammad is saying. A Muslim is someone who believes in God as the only true God, and that includes Jews and Christians. And he was not of the polytheists. Okay? Let's also look at Muhammad responding to the Christian tradition. Okay, remember, in the Christian tradition, a lot of conflict arises from a debate over the nature of Jesus and his relationship with God. Okay, and what Muhammad is saying is, guys, the idea of Jesus makes no sense. Jesus cannot be God. Jesus, at best, can only be a messenger of God, just like me. And the idea that Jesus is God makes no sense. Jesus was a human, just like me. God is God. He would not represent himself through a human. Okay, and so let's look at what he says. They disbelieve those who say Allah is the Messiah, the son of Mary. But the Messiah himself said, Messiah is Jesus, right? O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord. He's making a clear distinction. God is my God. I'm not God. I'm not his son. He is God. Whoever associates others with Allah, Allah has forbidden him paradise, and his dwelling is the fire. The wrongdoers have no saviors. All right? if you believe that Jesus is God, you are committing heresy against the true God. There can only be one God. There can't be two gods together. They disbelieve those who say Allah is the third of three, but there is no deity except the one God. If they do not refrain from what they say, a painful torment will befall those among them who disbelieve. So what he's saying, and this is very important, is that Muhammad is saying the Holy Trinity, the idea is just nonsense. They disbelieve those who say Allah is the third of three. Allah cannot be a fraction of anything. He is the one and only. Okay? Now, in our time, and we hear this, we don't really have emotional reaction, but place yourself back in their time, the year 622. Most Christians are being persecuted for refusing to accept the Holy Trinity as Scripture because it makes no sense. We discussed this in class. Okay? And now, but if you say it makes no sense, you could be killed. Okay? You'll be persecuted for sure. And now, Muhammad is saying, you guys were right all along. You should have believed in yourself all along. You were right all along, okay? So let's use an analogy. Let's just say, for example, like the world government. Okay, we have a world government, and for whatever reason, the world government tells us the sky is red. And you're like, wait a minute, I know blue and I know red, and the sky is blue. But if you say the sky is blue, you will be put in jail. You are not allowed to say the sky is blue. And then you have people, teachers like me, telling you, the reason why you believe the sky is blue and not red is your eyes lie to you. You cannot trust yourself. Your eyes are defective. That's a problem with human beings. We can't trust what we see. Okay? And you have to go through life believing the sky is red, even though you know in your heart it's blue. But then one day, someone like a teacher says to you in class, actually guys, we've been lying to you all along, the sky is blue. Imagine your sense of relief and empowerment and liberation when someone of authority actually tells you what you've always believed. Okay? That's what Muhammad is doing. Muhammad is confirming to everyone that what they believed, what they knew about God was right all along. Okay, so Muhammad's final message to the people is God is God and only God, and He is everywhere. And you can see Him, you can touch Him, because He's everywhere. And as such, you can feel Him, and He can be inside of you. Okay? And so this idea will actually occupy most of the Quran. Okay? And this is what He says. With Him are the keys of the unseen. None knows Him except He, and He knows everything on land and in the sea. Not a leaf falls, but He knows it. And there is not a single grain in the darkness of earth, nor is there anything wet or dry, but is in the clear record. All right? God is everywhere. You can see and touch Him in everything. Okay? And so, in other words, what's happening is that Islam is really the first monotheistic religion in the modern sense. Okay? When we think of monotheism, we actually think of the Islamic version of monotheism. All right, so what's the power of Islam? And I want you guys to remember this. Islam is, the power and beauty comes from how Islam is able to unite two major intellectual traditions in the world. The first is paganism, right? Remember the Vikings. The Vikings told stories. They acted out rituals. And therefore, there was an intimacy, concreteness, and interconnectedness to paganism that made us feel happy and good. Okay? It made us understand the world. It made us feel as though we could influence the world. That's the power of paganism. But Islam is doing the same thing by making God concrete. Okay? You can feel God. God is everywhere. He knows everything. But what Islam is also doing is He's seeking the simplicity, clarity, and absoluteness of monotheism. Okay? Monotheism is nice because with monotheism, everything becomes clear to you. Right? Okay, there's one God, therefore I just have to follow him. I just have to believe in him. There's like a million gods in paganism. And so it's unclear what you should do or how you should relate to this million gods. But here in monotheism, the relationship between God and you, it's very, very clear. Okay? So in other words, Islam is a major intellectual revolution in human history. And we have forgotten this because Islam, the idea, has embedded itself into modernity itself. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So what I will show you over the course of the semester is that Islam really is the proto-modernity. When we say that modernity began in Europe, we forget that Islam really built the basis for modernity. Okay? All right? So, fulfillment of the law and prophets. It's completing the story in the Bible. It's bringing God to the people. You can now touch God. You can now know God. That's the beginning of the idea of Protestantism, okay? And create heaven on earth. And this is the idea of science. Why do we use science? To make the world better. Because God wants us to make the world better. All right? So a lot of the ideas that will underpin modernity, that God can be in us, and that God expects us to make the world better, it's already there in the beginnings of Islam. And that's why we will have the Islamic Golden Age, because they are propelled by their devoutness to the one true God. Is this clear to you guys? Any questions so far? Any questions so far? All right, so let me really quickly answer the three mysteries. Okay, the first problem is, why were there no written records? The answer is, first of all, Islam marks a revolution. Okay, it is overturning the social order. The problem, though, is that eventually Islam will become the social order. So you obviously don't want to paint Muhammad as a revolutionary. Okay? That's the first problem. Muhammad represented a revolution against the social order. All right, that's the first thing. Second thing is that we know that his early followers, the companions, were all wiped out. They're all dead. They all died. The official history says that they died in military conflicts. But here's the amazing thing about early Islam history. We don't have that much evidence of military conflict between the Arabs and the Persians and the Byzantines. We don't. There's maybe one city, Caesarea, where there was a siege. But we think that a lot of the conquest happened organically, or maybe their enemies surrendered to them rather than fight them. Okay, and that's why I would say it's a revolution. It's not a conflict. It's not a conquest. It's a revolution where ordinary people were so disgusted with the current leadership that they opted for a new belief system. Okay. The problem, though, is that once you amass power and it's a coalition, the question then is, who's now in charge? So for the next 1,500 years, there'll be a series of civil war to determine who will be in charge, okay? Those early companions were probably purged. The word we use is purge. They're wiped out, including the Jews and the Christians. We know for a fact that in the early days of Islam, Jews and Christians were part of the hierarchy. There's a man named St. John of Damascus who was very famous, and he was a leading official in the Umayyad Caliphate. Okay? We know that as a fact, but eventually they were purged from the system. And if they're purged, what happens is they also purge the history. Okay? Because if these are the companions of Muhammad, Christians and Jews, then they're legitimate. They're more legitimate than you are. So therefore, they have to purge that history. Okay? But not only that, and the third thing is that there'll be a series of continuous civil wars among the Arabs in order to determine who will be the caliph. And obviously, they want to disguise this history. They want to disguise this history of civil conflict, okay? So the first 100 years, it was revolutionary, but it was also very tumultuous and bloody. And that's why they had to disguise the first 100 years of Islamic history, right? Does that make sense to you guys? And again, this is my explanation. I could be wrong, all right? There could be other explanations. Yeah?
Maybe just to throw in another idea.
Yep.
And I think what you said doesn't contradict this either. But
right.
One thing that's hard for us to imagine is that a culture would actually record its history with a historiography. It seems to us as a given, right?
Yep.
That, like Chinese culture, official historians going back for 2,200 years and so on, right? The Greeks had their ancient historians, the Romans had their ancient historians, but not every culture has its historians. The Persians didn't write history.
Right.
The Indians didn't write history, and I'm guessing the Arabs didn't have a tradition of writing down their history either, right? And so that this would actually be recorded in a sense that we'd be familiar with. Right. Probably wasn't the case.
That is a great point. Thank you, Doug. So Doug's point is that the idea of history comes to us from the Greeks and the Romans, who wrote everything down, okay? But as Doug says, there are many cultures who do not believe, or do not have institutions to write down history. We sort of take it for granted today, but back then, it was actually a pretty rare thing to actually want to write down your history. Okay, so a good reason why is that if you write down the history, you're also constrained by the history, right? And that's why a lot of empires chose to not write down their history. Okay, so thank you. Okay, all right. Second question is, why didn't Muhammad name a successor? And again, this is just my theory, but if it's the end of days, if it's the end of the world, you don't need to name a successor because God's coming, right? What's the point? In fact, if you name a successor, then you are admitting defeat, right? What Muhammad is saying to everyone is that every of your traditions, Jewish, Christian, Zoroastrian, are right. It's the end of days. God is coming. There'll be peace on the world. Therefore, we will no longer need leaders. You won't need Muhammad. I'm the last prophet, man. Okay, so that's why I think he didn't name a successor. But there could be other explanations, okay? Do you have another explanation? Okay. And the third is, why did they build the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the on the Temple Mount? And this explanation is going to be very controversial, okay? So the Jews support the Persians in their war against the Byzantines on the condition that the Persians would allow them to return to Jerusalem, but also on the condition that the Jews would be allowed to rebuild their temple, which is exactly what Cyrus the Great did, right? Cyrus the Great is called the Messiah in the Bible. He's the only foreign leader called the Messiah in the Bible because Cyrus the Great allowed them to rebuild the temple, okay? So what I'm saying is this. Al-Aqsa Mosque was originally the third temple. It is what the Arabs promised the Jews for the support. But over time, as these purchases happened, as the civil conflicts happened, then the Arabs needed to consolidate their authority. So they turned the third temple into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, that's what I think happened. If you go into I don't have time to go into the very detailed history of how the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built, but it was a process that took about 200 years. And it's very possible during these 200 years, intentions changed. Okay? So again, I know this is an extremely controversial statement, but I think that's what happened. Originally, it was meant to be the third temple. But then, over time, the Arab leaders changed their minds and thought to themselves that if we do this, then we make the Jews into a very powerful political entity within the Muslim world. Okay?